Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and welcome to the next part of the Q&A series. Today we'll be looking at the High Elves. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the first question. Once again, if I pronounce your name or username wrong, I apologize, but it cannot be helped. Raylana1 asks, is it possible for Kalidor Dragon Tamer to ever leave the Great Vortex, or is he stuck there maintaining the spell? So this one's a pretty simple answer. The Great Vortex is basically a spell that is so complicated and is such an ongoing process that all of the wizards who initially cast it are trapped there for the rest of eternity. Kalidor Dragon Tamer being among them, they can never leave. They can never rest even. They are permanently stuck just casting the spell for all of eternity. And there have been a few occasions in which individuals have attempted to mess with the Vortex, like Malekith and Morathi especially. And Kalidor Dragon Tamer has been forced to take action to defend the Vortex, in which case he shows that despite being trapped there and likely exhausted, he still wields a terrifying amount of power, even compared to the likes of those two who are some of the greatest casters alive, but I mean, even compared to Kalidor Dragon Tamer, they just don't match up. Of course, another role to play in that is that Kalidor likely is able to draw power from the Vortex itself, which makes him have access to a absolutely immense font of magic. But the basic answer to that question is no. Kalidor Dragon Tamer is incapable of leaving. He's essentially stuck in hell to an extent of him, and all of his greatest allies are permanently trapped. And if they should falter, even for a short amount of time, then the Vortex would almost immediately collapse. And the Chaos Demons would be free once more to swarm across the world, which would be bad for everyone. So unfortunately, he is trapped there. Likely until the end of days, in which case, if the Vortex were dismantled like it was in the end times, he would die promptly, very quickly. So that's pretty much the basic answer to that question. Next question! Cabadith B asks, what are the Assur's views on sex? What are their norms regarding the act? Are they more open or prudish? So, contrary to what some people may think, the High Elves, just like the other two, actually are pretty open about sex and their culture. If you read most books that focus on the High Elves, they view sex very openly, and it's not unusual for an elf to have like a partner, but also have a mistress, or maybe sleep with multiple people. Like the Everqueen, for instance, is supposed to sleep with the Phoenix King upon his coronation so that they can have a child who has, of course, the line of Asurin and Aisha being the Everqueen, and that's usually how the new Ever daughter, I guess you could call her, or Everchild, I think is what she's technically called, is born, is that she's supposed to be a descendant of the Phoenix King and the Everqueen at the time. But almost every Everqueen has like a massive group of consorts. Some of them, like Alariel, only really have one, where Tyrion was her consort and her lover. And Tyrion is a good example of this, because Tyrion is considered very weird by the elves because he only has one partner, which is Alariel, and he's faithful to her. And that's considered extremely odd and quirky among the elves. If anything, they consider Tyrion very prudish compared to the rest of them, because he has this very strong sense of loyalty in his concept of romance. To most elves, sex is just a recreational activity, and they certainly they're not nearly as like prudish, quote unquote, as like humans are, with the idea of getting married and only having a single partner. That's very unusual for elves. There are numerous stories you can look at that have elves sleeping openly with each other. If you read like the Gotrek and Felix novel, Giant Slayer, that has Teclis in it, I think the book starts off with him sleeping with a pair of twins. But yeah, the elves, all three of them are pretty open when it comes to that sort of thing. Which, of course, a lot of people think that because the population of the elves is declining, that must mean that, and because they don't have many children, that must mean that they don't engage in sexual acts very often, and that's not really the case. The elves are very sexually active, all of them. When it comes to conception, though, it seems that the elves have other difficulties limited by their biology. I don't think they're like humans where, a human woman is able to get pregnant, has like a time of a month where there's like a golden point you can aim for. For elves, it seems to be much more restrictive in that maybe there's only a certain point during the year, or maybe every few years, or maybe even every many years, where elves are able to actually conceive a child. But no, elves are definitely not prudish. Compared to the other elves, like the dark elves, you could consider the high elves prudish, but that's because the dark elves are into, like, they worship Hethardi, who is the goddess of pleasure, essentially, and so they're into these really, like, hardcore, rituals of just blood orgies, and the dark elves kind of take it over the top. Like, where the high elves are okay with having multiple partners and sleeping around, and, like, sex is considered this pretty open idea that anyone can engage in, and it's not that big of a deal. The dark elves have this, like, really rapey and, like, super over-the-top kink culture that, like, takes everything to the level of absolute extreme. The whole point of the dark elves is that they don't have limits. They push past those limits, whereas the high elves sort of keep themselves a little reserved and keep themselves within control of the situation. They don't completely go out and, like, jump themselves up on X and just screw anything that moves. They're a little more in control of themselves in the situation than that. But thanks for the question, Capitith. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one. All right, our next question is from Christian Ludvigsen, who asks, do all the elven races in the Warhammer world descend from the High Elves? And if they do, how did they become Dark Elves and Wood Elves, etc.? So this one's pretty straightforward. The original race of the Elves was created by the Old Ones and were placed on the continent of Ulthuan, which is, of course, a floating island in the middle of the sea, and it was much bigger back then. And this island was literally supposed to be a paradise for them, and in many ways it was. What ended up happening was much later on, after, of course, Chaos had come into the world and been defeated, and Anarion had died, Anarion the Defender. The son of Anarion, who, there were two of them, but the one who's important was named Malekith. And Malekith was in a really well lined up position to be the next Phoenix King, because he was a war hero. He was very much like his father in all the positive ways. He was very gifted at magic and battle and politics. But the elves, the Council of High Elves were worried that he had a little bit too much of his mother in him, because Morathi kind of always had this really shady thing to her, and there were a lot of nasty rumors about what had happened with Anarion's court while he ruled in Nagaryth alongside Morathi, which is where Malekith was raised. And so they decided to go, instead of going with a warlike Phoenix King, they decided to vote for a Phoenix King who would bring in an age of peace, which was Belshazzar. So this kind of rubbed Malekith the wrong way, and Morathi was, like, super upset about it. And it led to this whole ordeal that eventually led to Malekith, after being manipulated by his mother and a couple of other events happening over the course of, like, 1,000 years or something. Malekith assassinated Belshazzar and basically claimed the Phoenix Throne for himself. He tried to walk through the Flame of Assurin, which the Flame of Assurin is this giant pyre of holy fire that's like the god himself represented on the mortal plane. And if you can pass through the flame unscathed, it means that Assurin has judged you worthy, and you have the right to be a Phoenix King. Well, Malekith walked into it, and he got burned horribly bad, and was not able to make it through. Like, he realized he was going to die. And so he threw himself back out the way he had entered, which means he had essentially been rejected by Assurin. And this led to a huge civil war, where all of the High Elves that they were now known as they were the ones who backed up Belshazzar and the electoral process to select the Phoenix King, and they believe that what Malekith had done by assassinating the Phoenix King and then murdering pretty much every prince who had a chance of becoming the Phoenix King except for one of them, who was Emmerich, ended up being this... they all basically sided against him, while the rest of the elves, who would become known as the Dark Elves eventually, sided with Malekith and thought that he deserved to be the Phoenix King. And they had this huge civil war called the Sundering that was just an absolute mess. And Emmerich, of course, ended up changing his name to Calidor I when he became the Phoenix King. Not to be confused with Calidor Dragon Tamer. There's Calidor Dragon Tamer, who was the High Elf Mage that made the Vortex. Calidor I, who was the Phoenix King after Belshazzar, and he was the one who won the War of the Sundering and pushed Malekith out off of Ulthuan. Of course, when Malekith left Ulthuan, he tried to mess with the Vortex and unbind it, and it ended up causing this cataclysmic event on Ulthuan where almost half of the entire continent was destroyed and lost beneath the ocean, and millions of elves died, and it was a horrible, horrible event. Of course, the Dark Elves escaped most of the carnage. Many of their followers died, but all of their important individuals had gone to mighty fortresses and cast a spell that allowed the ground beneath them to be ripped off the continent, and they just floated on the ocean. And that was the creation, of course, of the Black Arcs. And all the Black Arcs floated off to Nagaroth, which was, at that point, an unsettled land, and they created their own little empire out there. Well, there was actually a couple of High Elf colonies out there, but they were overwhelmed rather quickly. So what happened? So that was when you got the schism that led to the High Elves and the Dark Elves. The Wood Elves occurred when, back during and you can see this in my Wood Elf history video, but during the First War Against Chaos, when Astariel, who was the Ever-Queen at that time, she was basically cornered and surrounded by a massive host of demons led by Nakari, who is Slaaneash's preeminent greater demon. And her children were with her, and they were all going to die. And Dorthu was there too with some forest spirits, and Astariel basically begged Dorthu to save her kids no matter the cost. And he told her the only way he could save them was by kind of violating his own rules and taking them through a secret path that no bloody creature, not warm blood, it's lizardman, but no bloody creature was allowed to pass through. So he broke the rules and took the children with him on the condition that in return for saving Astariel's children now, the forest, or Athel Loren, would have the right to claim many children of the High Elves at some point in the future for its own. And Astariel, being really desperate, agreed. And so Dorthu saved her children, of course. And much, much, much later, after the War of the Beard, or the War of Vengeance, where the elves fought the dwarves, the elves lost the war when Calidor II was killed by Gotrek Starbreaker. And the elves decided to retreat back to Ulthuan because Malekith had engineered that war, playing both of them for fools. And when the High Elves had finally invested all of their might in a big invasion against the dwarves, the moment they left, Malekith invaded from the west. And so basically, the true full power of the High Elves showed up on the coast of the Old World, and word almost immediately arrived that Malekith was attacking, and so they all turned right around and left. Like, the big, super hardcore part of the elves didn't really even get to fight the dwarves. Of course, many of their elite armies did, but this was like all of the power Ulthuan had ready to go to, start another century or two of the Civil War, or not the Civil War, but the war between the dwarves and elves. But the elves decided, you know what, we need to go home or Malekith's going to take Ulthuan. So they all left, and the Phoenix King at that time, Caradriel, ordered all of the High Elves to evacuate the Old World, because the dwarves were pissed and had ordered the High Elves to leave, and they were going to kill anyone that didn't. And some of the High Elves that lived near a giant forest that they came to call Athel Loren said, no, we're not leaving, because they had this really powerful urge to stay and near the forest. And some of them there were even some Dark Elves who felt the urge and actually abandoned Malekith and abandoned the Dark Elves to go find and live in this forest. And that was essentially Dorthu had finally made good on his end of the bargain and had claimed quite a number of elves as his own for the forest. So a whole bunch of elves defected from both the High Elves and the Dark Elves and said, nope, we're an independent nation now, we're not taking orders from you anymore. And they all went to Athel Loren, where a series of events happened, but that led to the creation of the Wood Elves. So basically, the long story short is that there were only elves on Ulthuan, and then there was a civil war that split them into the High Elves, who stayed on Ulthuan, and the Dark Elves, who were kicked out and banished to Nagaroth, who attack Ulthuan very, very often, trying to get that island back. And then after the war with the Dwarves, when the High Elves retreated from the Old World, some of them stayed behind and would become what we now know as the Wood Elves, along with a number of elves who defected from Malekith's cause. And that's essentially the answer to that question. So let's move on. Azka Muski asks, are High Elf Spearmen a match for most enemy infantry? So, the general answer is going to be, in my honest opinion, no. High Elf Spearmen are very, very good against low to low, maybe medium tier infantry. Against high tier infantry, they get absolutely butchered. And the reason for that is High Elves are very fast, very skilled, but they have two crucial weaknesses. At least the High Elf Spearmen do, which is that they're not very strong and they have very, very terrible defense. So while they're able to typically put in a ton of attacks before their enemy has the chance to swing, if they're fighting something like Saurus or Greenskins or Dwarves or Chaos Warriors, they really struggle to do damage. Because they really struggle just to get in the initial damage on those types of models that have that higher defense. And then they also really struggle to get past that armor because High Elf Spears are not armor piercing like Wood Elf Spears are. High Elves have the advantage in that they fight in deeper ranks because of their how martially skilled they are, because all of them train so hard. But this only works well against, low tier infantry that tend to be more of a mass. And that's what I would say they specialize against. High Elf Spearmen specialize really well against mass groups. So like a horde of goblins or a lot of Skaven or skinks or light cavalry, things like that. High Elf Spearmen will butcher them because they're much, much faster. And basically, if you charge that spear wall, the entire thing's coming at you and is going to strike you before you get the chance because elves are so swift. But their damage output is very low. And if something survives to swing back at them, and it's stronger than a goblin, it's going to eradicate them. Like, orcs can just put the beating on them. Saurus and Chaos Warriors will dominate them without even trying. And those are all like medium to high tier infantry, and the actual high tier infantry just absolutely stomps on them. So no, High Elf Spearmen are not very elite. They are, granted, they're the absolute basic core of the High Elf army list. Even Lothar and Seaguard are a little bit above High Elf Spearmen because Lothar and Seaguard have bows in addition to spears. But of course, the advantage the High Elf Spearmen have is that they actually have essentially what you would understand as a formation that lets them fight in deeper ranks than any other Spearmen unit in the game. So they're a group that really specializes in defense, but you really don't want to use them against anything with high armor because they're just not going to cut it. But if it's low armor, yeah, they'll typically do a good job. So for most enemy, I would say for most enemy infantry, depending on the race, they're pretty reliable. So, I would say about somewhere between 40, maybe like 35 to 45% infantry, the High Elf Spearmen are going to dominate them, but that 55% is just going to dominate them the other way. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's see. Demon Dave asks, can a High Elf or any other type of elf and human mate to make a half elf? As well, has there been any in the lore? This is a pretty simple question, or answer, not the most simple question, but the answer is no. Unlike Tolkien's universe, elves and humans in the Warhammer Fantasy universe cannot crossbreed. They are fundamentally different species. They're very alien to one another. They kind of look similar, but when you go back into like the more intricate parts of the lore, elves in general are a very different species than human. Like, they're humanoid, but like elves, if you look at them close up, you know, you have the pointy ears, they're much taller, they have elongated limbs and heads. They also tend to have almond-shaped eyes that, for like wood elves, are almost entirely black. I think for the high elves, they're very similar to that, but a tiny bit different. But they are very, very different species with very different ancestors, and the old ones created them to be fundamentally different. That'd be like trying to mate a dwarf with either one of them, or an ogre with either one of those. It's just not going to work. Have there been elves that have slept with humans? Yes, that has definitely happened. There are plenty of dark elves who have had relations with members of other races. Those are documented events, especially humans. That being said, there has never, ever been a half-breed. And there never will be. It's just not a possible thing within the Warhammer universe. They're just too different, and their creations were from gods who created them to be very entirely different species. They are not. They may look similar, but other than that, there's no relation there. None at all. Hope that answers your question. Our next question comes from Canovia, whose question essentially is, how exactly do females line up in the High Elf armies? In that we know that there are units like the Sisters of Avalorn who are pure female, but he's also wondering about, can they become White Lions, Phoenix Guards, Swordmasters, etc. So this is a question I see argued about a lot, is people trying to figure out if there can be different genders within certain groups or classifications of the elves. So the simple answer, it's very easy. When it comes to the High Elves, and this is not the case for all of the elves, this is just the case with the High Elves, there can be female High Elves in every single unit type. The White Lions have a history of having female members, as do the Phoenix Guard, as do the Swordmasters. All three of them exist. Mainly, I don't think Games Workshop used to worry too much about these sort of things, but when Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning came out, they suddenly tried to focus on the idea of broadening the possibility of female members of various races being more active, and the High Elves were one of those that they hit really hard, and that there were Swordmasters and White Lions as playable, and they got female versions. And of course, this was held over into like the 8th edition book series, The Sons of Aurelian, where there is a female Swordmaster in the book. And female Phoenix Guard is, of course, fairly common, because becoming a Phoenix Guard has more to do with destiny than your gender. The High Elves are not a race that really divides up their genders. The only unit, funny enough, in the Elven army the High Elven army that is like one gender, and that's guaranteed, is the Sisters of Avalorn. And that has to do with the fact that they are the maiden guard, essentially, of the Everqueen. That's the only reason that they're solo-gendered. I'm not 100% certain to say that there have been female dragon princes. I'm 99.9% sure there have been. I know there's female Silverhelms, and dragon princes are essentially just the Silverhelms of Kalador, with a little bit of extra spice. So I would say with 99.9% certainty, with all the books I've ever read, which is a very long list, especially when it comes to the High Elves, or the Elves in general, I have all of their books. The High Elves in particular, and this actually applies mostly to the Wood Elves as well, there's a few little niche ones in there, but the High Elves and the Wood Elves in particular are very co-gendered with all of their options. The Dark Elves are actually the elf faction that has the most examples of solo-gendered units, and that's not necessarily because they ban, like, certain genders. It's more of because, like, when you have the K-Knights, all of the guys tend to become this one type of unit, while all of the girls tend to become this other type of unit. So, hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, when it comes to the High Elves, there is no solo-gendered unit, with the exception of the Sisters of Avalorn, who are, of course, an 8th edition unit, and the only reason that they are female only is because they're the handmaidens of the Everqueen, who go to battle in the most... when situations are very dire. And of course, that is the only example of that, so hopefully that answers your question. Alright, our next question comes from Leonhard Tomisius, who asked, whose navy is better, the High Elves or the Dark Elves? This answer is actually much simpler than most people realize, but the High Elves actually have the best navy. And the reason we know that is that when the Dark Elves... The Dark Elves have a powerful navy, don't get me wrong, and they also obviously have Black Arcs, which are intimidating and terrifying fortresses that are often surrounded by a fleet of ships. However, when it comes to venturing the ocean in fleets, the Dark Elves are very, very careful to utilize stealth. Whenever they go out across the ocean, they are very, very careful to try and travel light, travel quickly, and avoid the truly powerful fleets of the High Elves. And the simple reason for that is that the High Elves, A, are better positioned to dominate a global navy, being that they have an island right smack in the center of basically the two halves of the world, whereas the Dark Elves only can come from Nagaroth. The Dark Elves also have a problem where there's only a vaguely small window during the course of the year in which the Dark Elf fleets can actually leave and enter Nagaroth. During most of the year, outside of like late spring, early summer, most of the bays that the Dark Elves use to send their ships or their fleets in and out are frozen, and you just can't get in. And so the Dark Elves tend to have this little window of time where, like, all the ships come in, they drop off all their slaves and their materials and all this other stuff, and then they leave again. But when it comes to all-out wars of fleets, the High Elves are just, quite frankly, able to overmatch the Dark Elves when it comes to the sheer size of their fleets. And the Dark Elves fleets tend to be more of like a Black Arc at the center of it, protected by a series of different types of ships. Unfortunately for the Dark Elves, while the Black Arcs are very intimidating and very powerful, one of the only races in the world that knows how to reliably destroy them is the High Elves. In that the High Elves have ships that are literally designed to take on Black Arcs by either ramming them or bombarding them with magical artillery or other things like that. The Dark Elves are very keen to avoid the High Elves at all costs when they're on the ocean, because the High Elves actually have routes. Like, the High Elves don't hide where they are. They have very semi-predictable routes where they flow across the ocean looking for Dark Elves and Norskins and other things to try and make the ocean safe for trade and travel. And they do not take kindly to people messing with them. And the Dark Elves just are not able to go toe-to-toe with them unless they pretty much go all out, but the Dark Elves would never take that risk. The Dark Elves are much more calculating when it comes to how they engage their enemies, and engaging the High Elves in an open battle on the seas is not something the Dark Elves would even remotely be interested in, because it would be far too dangerous for them. And the High Elves losing a dragon ship, which is their largest tier class ship that actually can have like 2 dragons on board because it's so damn big. The Dark Elves losing a Black Arc is far more devastating, because a Black Arc, you know, of course, is essentially a city while also being a ship. And if they lose one of those, you can't really make new Black Arcs. Black Arcs were kind of a one-time only thing, and after they've been made, that's it. You don't get any more. So the Dark Elves are much more cautious when they approach naval combat than the High Elves are, and the High Elves are easily the most dominant naval force in the entire Warhammer world. So hopefully that answers your question. Alright, our next question comes from the Gaming Lizard, who asks, question about the High Elves. Which of their mages was the first to learn High Elven magic, and who was the Slaawn who taught them? So, the first of the elves to learn magic are long dead, and we have no idea who they are. They were the earliest ancestors of the elves. What we do know, however, is that Lord Croak, who was the very first of the Slaawn, was the one who was responsible for teaching the elves how to use magic. He's the one who likely was on Ulthuan for some time and taught their earliest ancestors how to control the much more stable at that time type of magic that existed in the world, and taught them how to flow with it and understand it and embrace it. Of course, this was helped by the fact that the Old Ones created the High Elves to be very magically attuned beings, almost, and the Old Ones actually decided they were too magically attuned, in that they were too easily corrupted by it. But the only thing we know for certain about those early days is that Lord Croak was the one who taught them. But we don't know who they were, we don't know when they died, or anything like that. Because, I mean, there were thousands of years between when many of the younger races, being the elves and the dwarves, were created before chaos showed its ugly face on the world. Humans had notably less time than that, as did the ogres and the halflings. They only, at best, had centuries, if not decades, before chaos showed up. But for the elves, that part of their history is long lost to time. The only thing we know is that Lord Croak taught them, and it's likely that he had something to do with helping them learn magic, and likely was there when the very first ever queen was selected, and when the elves, by their mere existence, essentially their emotions likely created the elven pantheon, and they started interacting with them and creating the creation myths for them, and then the elven gods, of course, started playing out those events, which led to the first war in heaven. But the dark gods had their hand in that as well. So that's a conversation, of course, for another time. But I hope that answers your question. Alright, and next is from Gabrielle Parella, who asks a similar question, or at least in a similar vein, which says, so it is pretty much clear and stated that the elves were created by the Old Ones, and from what I've gathered, the elves worship the Old Ones to a lesser degree, or at least admire them. I want to know, are the elven gods actually Old Ones? Is there any sort of connection between them at all? And if they are Old Ones, how come the lizardmen don't worship the elven gods as well, and the elves don't worship Sotek and the other entities of the lizardmen as well? Okay, so there is a very large difference between the Old Ones and the elven gods. And the Warhammer universe addressed this a while ago. They stopped worrying about it in the most recent editions, which, if anything, made things more confusing. But basically, the elves understand that the Old Ones existed, and they have an inkling of an idea that the Old Ones created them. But the elves also believe and worship the elven pantheon, and believe that Ashurin, created the gods, and of course Kurnos and Aisha are the parents, essentially, of the elves. And the elves have this really complicated sense of philosophy where they essentially, a human like us sees those as competing theories. The fact that the Old Ones created them, but so did the elven pantheon. To the actual elves, this is not a contradiction. Both of these ideas existing simultaneously makes sense and is acceptable to them. What they likely understand from it is that the Old Ones created the ancestors of the elves. They created the first copy of the elves, and they taught their ancestors everything they needed to know to allow the elves to flourish on Ulthuan. However, once the Old Ones taught them everything they needed to know, and Lord Croak taught them magic, and then they all left to go work on other projects, The elves seem to have at that point developed their own religion and seem to may have well evolved physically, societally, and socially into what we now understand as the elves, which may be how the elves kind of make logic of that, what we think is a conundrum. So exactly how the elves understand it, nobody knows. Games Workshop essentially pulled a cop-out by just saying that the elves don't view it as a contradiction. They view it as something that makes sense. But they kind of pulled the card of like, oh, because the elves understand it, they can't explain it to humans because humans just don't get it. And of course, the readers are guaranteed to be humans, so we just don't get it. My personal theory is more along the lines that the elves acknowledge their pantheon and worship them, despite the fact that they know that they were likely not first created by them. It may be that the way they currently identify and the way that they are now, like their physical, spiritual, and emotional states, are, crafted by those gods. Because the Elven Pantheon did not exist when the elves first were born by the old ones, and the Slann helping out with all that stuff. The Elven Pantheon developed afterwards, and were created by the elves' emotions and ideals and feelings interacting with the realm of chaos, which the realm of chaos is where all gods are birthed from, with the exception, of course, of the old ones who were something different. And the ancestor gods of the dwarves, who were something also different. So, to the elves, they probably see these entities who were born out of the realm of chaos as their gods, and also as their true parents, the ones who raised them, as opposed to the old ones who just created them. And that's likely how that supposing contradiction logics out to the elves. Because the war in heaven, which once again I'm going to be talking about in a video coming up very soon, it's going to be the next lore video I do is going to be the Elven Pantheon and their kind of spiel. So we'll talk more about that when that happens. I know it's very complicated sounding, but when I have time to sit down and make the video about it and kind of guide you all through the war in heaven and all the stuff about exactly how the Elven Pantheon works, hopefully it'll make more sense. But I can tell you for a fact that the Elven Pantheon is the most inconsistent and problem-causing pantheon of the Warhammer universe, in that Games Workshop was very inconsistent between various editions with them, in that, like, in 6th edition, Cain was, like, for instance, a much more worldly god and was worshipped by some humans, and then in 7th edition, they went back to being a pure elven focus, and then in 8th edition, their pantheon went from, like, 6 or 7 gods to, like, 20 gods, or 24 gods, I think it is now, and they ended up having this really weird relationship with the realm of chaos, and then, of course, the end times happened, which made everything 20 times more confusing. But we'll talk about that all in a later video, so I hope that answer will suffice for now, but know that we'll be addressing it soon. And for today's final question, we have Joachim Schipper, I know that I got that wrong, who asks, what is the main weakness of the High Elves? Because their army looks to be very well-rounded. So, first of all, yes, the High Elves have a fairly well-rounded roster with monsters of unmounted and mounted variants, chariots, cavalry, heavy cavalry, light cavalry, of course, light infantry, heavy infantry, so on and so forth. However, all elves, the High Elves, of course, being a part of this, have one very crucial weakness. And the Wood Elves are more immune to this because they have Tree Spirits bolstering out their roster. But for the High Elves in particular, the High Elves, defense-wise, are absolutely wimpy. They are so squishy, as we call it, it's not even funny. Elves are very low in toughness and health and very low armor. They tend to rely more heavily on skill and speed above all of their traits, and because of that, they are kind of like glass cannons in that they hit very reliably. I wouldn't say they hit very hard. Elves are also not a very hard-hitting race. They're very accurate, and they're very skilled, but they often lack the means to pierce heavy armor The High Elves do anyway. The High Elves struggle very, very much with heavy armor, and they struggle very, very much against high damaging enemies, or even lots and lots of low damaging enemies. The High Elves are an elitist force, so they tend to be very outnumbered. They tend to be kind of outgunned too when it comes to pure damage dealing or defense. You know, the High Elves do not have any sort of heavy plate or gromril or chaos armor or lizardmen heavy scales or any of that stuff. They have very like Empire basic infantry levels of armor on almost all of their guys. There are, of course, exceptions, like the Phoenix Guard are the toughest infantry in the game because they have a godlike aura around them, and basically they've seen their deaths, so they're able to approach the world knowing when they're going to die, and essentially anything that happens to them that's not their death, they just preternaturally avoid it because they know what's going to happen. So that kind of works out as them having a very high ward save, the highest in tabletop when it comes to a unit, which will, of course, probably translate in Total War Warhammer to them having an extremely high physical resistance. I would be surprised if it's less than 40%. But the overall, though, the High Elves are extremely squishy. If somebody can outgun them, especially at range, they tend to be in really big trouble. Of course, the High Elves have things to round out their roster to save them a little bit, in that they have things like dragons. Of course, they have the most types of dragons in the game. They have phoenixes who are very, very powerful and provide very substantial effects that help the High Elves out in the field. They also have, and of course they're very accurate. So like they have a lot of bows and, you know, things like that that have very, very long range, and the elves are extremely accurate with them, but they don't armor pierce. So if they're fighting someone who has a lot of heavy armor and shields, well, you know, all the arrows in the world tend not to help you as much in that scenario. And that's something the elves definitely struggle with. That being said, of course, they have strengths as well. Like the High Elves have the fastest heavy cav in the game because they have a unique type of barding that makes their steeds as fast as light cav while still having incredibly heavy armor, being Ithalmo barding, which is the special type of armor that the elves have access to. But when it comes to the High Elves, I would say their biggest weakness lies very heavily in defense. When it comes to offense, they can kind of make up for it with dragons and eagle claw bolt throwers, which have a pretty heavy punch, and stuff like white lions and swordmasters can do some pretty good damage. But almost all High Elves, if you can put the hurt on them with, you know, basic, you know, with just regular archers, or just outnumber them with, you know, low tier infantry and just get them completely surrounded and start wailing on them, they tend to just collapse and die. Hopefully in Total War Warhammer, the elves are going to be saved a bit by having high melee defense to make up for their pretty not spectacular armor, but we're going to have to see how Creative Assembly decides to interpret the High Elves on tabletop. But I can tell you, when it comes to tabletop, High Elves are a powerful army, but in my honest opinion, they are nowhere near the top 3. They can get there with a really particular build that centers around Frostheart Phoenixes, which the Ice Phoenixes are, of course, the most powerful. They're very, very scary. But many races can just walk up to High Elf infantry and just mow them down without exerting themselves too much. Like, if, you know, some races obviously struggle, like, you know, orcs and goblins and some of the other really low-tier armies, because they're not fast enough and they don't have good enough armor, and so the elves can just run them over. But most of the elite armies, like Lizardmen, Warriors of Chaos, Demons of Chaos, and all those guys don't really struggle that much against, you know, most High Elf units. So hopefully that answers your question. I don't know 100% if that's going to translate super well into Total War Warhammer, if they're going to decide to go a different direction with it. We'll have to wait and see. Some of the things about the Lizardman roster have caught me off guard, but like I said, we're just going to have to kind of play it by ear. So I hope you guys all enjoyed this video. As a bonus question, someone asked, what High Elf is the least smug asshole of them all? And I couldn't not answer this question. And the answer, quite honestly, I would say is Finnabar, the Phoenix King. And the reason I would say that is the reason Finnabar is king, which a lot of people wonder about this, and not like some great warrior. Finnebar was not selected by the conclave of princes for his prowess as a fighter. Finnebar was selected because he was the only high elf who had journeyed almost the entire world, seen all the nations of men, actually met the realm of the wood elves, and had done many other things, because the last Phoenix King had requested him to go explore the world to find out what the hell was going on with everyone. You know, he had made contact with the dwarves. Finnebar is a diplomat, a politician, and he's a very kind-hearted soul who actually cares about the wider world and understands that the elves have to be a part of it. And in many ways, I would say he is the least smug asshole of all the elves, because he has a very worldly viewpoint, whereas most of the high elves are obsessed with themselves and don't think they need to worry about the world, and don't think that they need to learn about the other races because they think the high elves are the best race, and therefore everyone should, you know, basically bow down and do what they say. I'd say a close second is Teclis, because Teclis works very hard against... Teclis understands that he has a prejudice against other races and that he thinks he's better than them, but he realizes that he suffers from that condition, and Teclis actually attempts to work on it. He's not perfect by any means. Teclis can still be a dick, but he tries, at least, to be understanding and to be kind and to do what he can to help the other races and to try and understand them. But I would say at the end of the day, Finnebar is probably the nicest of the high elves. But I hope that answers everyone's questions. That's 11 questions for today about the high elves, so I hope you all enjoyed it. We'll of course be continuing the Q&A series every week. I think for next week we're gonna do 2 of them, probably one on Saturday and one on Sunday. Sunday will be Lizardmen because I have so many questions I still need to do on that. But for next Saturday, let's go ahead and do Skaven. Let's do Skaven. So if you have any questions about the Ratmen of the Under Empire, feel free to type them into the comment section below, or you can go to my Discord channel and ask them in the Q&A section, or channel. So I hope you all have a great day, a great weekend. I'm going to be out of town on vacation for a little bit. Of course, I'll be back for the following weekend, but that's why you probably won't hear from me much this weekend. So I hope you all have a great time doing whatever it is you're doing. I love you all very much, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.